River Mumma. Episode 2. What the River Carries. Let us talk about what a river carries. Not the scientific inventory, not the silt and the mineral content and the dissolved oxygen and the temperature gradient as you move from the mountain source down to the coastal estuary. Those things are real and they matter, but they are not what I am talking about. I am talking about the other inventory. The one that does not appear in any hydrological survey. The one that the river accumulates not through geology, but through time, through the specific kind of time that only a place that has been witnessed by thousands of generations of human beings can accumulate. The time that is made not of minutes and hours, but of everything that has ever happened on its banks, everything that has ever been said into its current, every grief and every relief and every desperate prayer that has ever been offered to it by a person who had run out of anywhere else. To bring those things. A river that old carries all of that. The Jamaican rivers carry all of that. And it is in that carrying, in that accumulated weight of human experience pressed into the water the way memory is pressed into the body, that you begin to understand what River Mumma actually is. Not a creature who happens to live in the river's own consciousness. The thing that holds all of it together. The thing that knows what the river knows. What does the river know? It knows everything that has ever been brought to it. Every morning that a woman came down to the bank with a basket of washing before the sun was fully up, her children still asleep in the house, and stood in the cold of the current for an hour in the particular quality of silence that belongs only to the very early morning by water, before the day with all its demands had properly started. The river held that silence. It holds it still. In the way certain pools hold the cold even in August, in the way certain bends in the current move with a patience that seems to have nothing to do with the volume of water flowing through them, in the way the light on a river surface at 6 in the morning has a quality that you cannot find anywhere else at any other time, that seems to come from inside the water rather than from the sky above it. The women who came to wash knew this. They felt it without necessarily having language for it. They knew that the river in the early morning was a different place from the river at midday, and that the difference was not only a matter of light and temperature. They knew that something was more present in those early hours, more available, more inclined to listen. This is the thing about River Mumma that the folk stories almost never say directly, but that saturates every account of her that has survived the centuries of telling and retelling. She is not equally accessible at all times and to all people. She is a sovereign, not a service. Her attention moves according to her own priorities, her own moods, her own reading of the situation at the river on any given day. And the people who understood this, the people who had learned over generations how to be in relationship with the river rather than simply in proximity to it, those people developed a sophisticated set of practices and protocols that governed how you approached the water, what you said when you got there, what you brought, what you asked for, and, perhaps most importantly, what you did not do. These protocols were not written down. They did not need to be. They were carried in the body. The way rhythm is carried in the body, the way the smell of a particular food can carry an entire childhood inside it, not learned intellectually but absorbed through presence, through repetition, through the specific transmission that happens when a child watches a grandmother do something the right way enough times that the rightness of it becomes instinctive. You did not go to the river empty-handed if you had something to ask. This was the first and most fundamental of the protocols, and it was so deeply understood in the communities that lived along Jamaica's rivers that stating it aloud would have seemed almost unnecessary. The way it would seem unnecessary to remind someone to say good morning when they walk into a room where their elder is sitting. You brought something. Not necessarily something large or expensive. The river was not transactional in the way that word is usually used, did not operate on the logic of a market where the size of your offering determined the quality of your return. What you brought was understood as something more like a demonstration of intent, a physical way of saying, I am not here carelessly. I know what this place is. I know what you are. I am bringing what I have because bringing what I have is the honest way to begin a conversation with something that deserves honesty. Flowers from the bank. Fruit from the yard. Rum poured into the current so that the river received it and carried it away downstream. Sometimes a candle, set at the water's edge so that its light moved on the surface of the river until the current finally took it. These things were not magic. They were manners. And in the tradition that River Mumma belonged to, manners were not a social formality. They were the operating system of the relationship between the human world and the world that existed just underneath the human world's daily attention. The fishermen knew this most intimately of any group. The men who made their living from the Jamaican rivers, the freshwater fishermen who worked the Rio Cabra's deeper pools, who knew the Black River's moods the way you know the moods of someone you have lived with for 40 years, who could read the surface of the Yalas on a Thursday morning and tell you without hesitation whether today was a day the river wanted to give and whether it was a day the river wanted to keep. Those men did not approach the water the way a factory worker approaches a machine. They approached it the way a guest approaches someone else's house. You announced yourself. You said something at the water before you put your line in. Not loudly, not ceremonially, not in any way that would have looked from the outside like anything other than a man standing at the edge of a river murmuring something under his breath. But the content of that murmuring was specific. It had a structure. It acknowledged what the river was and who it belonged to, asked permission to take from it what you needed, and promised in the implicit language of the tradition that what you took would not be wasted, would be used to feed the people in your house, would be received with the gratitude that belongs to the receiving of a gift rather than the entitlement that belongs to the taking of a resource. The fishermen who skipped this, the young men, sometimes, who thought the old ways were ceremony without substance, who thought the fish did not care what you said before you put your hook in the water, those fishermen noticed things. Not every time. Not in any way that could be plotted on a graph or submitted as evidence. But often enough and consistently enough across enough generations of telling that the noticing became a piece of knowledge that the community held collectively. The river gave differently to the person who asked than to the person who simply took. And the river gave differently still to the person who asked properly, who understood that asking properly meant not just saying the words, but inhabiting the relationship that the words pointed toward, bringing your full attention and your genuine respect and your honest knowledge of what you were standing next to when you stood at the edge of that water. The fish felt this. Or something felt it. Or the river felt it, and the fish, being part of the river, moved accordingly. The explanation varied depending on who was giving it. The observation was consistent. The drought years made this knowledge visible in ways that the good years kept quiet. When the rains did not come, when the Blue Mountains stopped sending their cold streams down into the lowland rivers, when the Rio Mijo ran shallow and the pools where the fish gathered in the deep season became exposed and small and diminished in those years, the conversations with the river became more frequent, more formal, more collectively organized. It was not only individual fishermen at the bank at dawn with their offerings. It was the community coming to the river together, coming in the early morning before the heat of the day, coming with what they had, which in the drought years was sometimes very little, and bringing it to the water with the specific urgency of people who understood that the relationship they were in was not merely spiritual, but practical, that the health of the river was the health of their survival, that if River Mumma was displeased or absent or turned in her attention toward some other concern, the river would show it in its levels and its temperature and its willingness to give up the fish that it held in its deeper channels. She was not always pleased. This is important to say clearly, because the tendency in the retelling of River Mumma stories is to soften her into something more comfortable, something benign and maternal and unconditionally available, the way certain kinds of storytelling soften powerful female figures into the shape of a resource rather than the shape of a sovereign. River Mumma in the oldest accounts is not soft. She is fair. She is consistent. She applies the same rules to everyone who comes to her water, regardless of who they are or how important they believe themselves to be. But she is not warm in the way that warmth is usually meant, not indulgent in the way that a parent indulges a child who has done something they know is wrong, not interested in the kind of pleading that substitutes emotion for accountability. The river was what it was. The water was what it was. And when the relationship between the community and the river had been damaged, when the protocols had been disrespected, when someone had taken without asking or polluted what was clean or treated the river as a drain rather than a living thing with its own dignity, the river showed this in the only language it had, which was the language of its own behavior. It ran lower. It ran slower. The fish moved to different depths, to different pools, to different parts of the river that were harder to reach and less willing to yield. The water that had been clean became less clear. The green light that rose from the deep on the nights when River Mumma was present dimmed, flickered, sometimes went out entirely, and the fishermen who came at dawn to read the river found a surface that told them nothing, a current that gave nothing away. A depth that remained opaque in a way that felt pointed, felt deliberate, felt like a door that had been closed by someone who had not yet decided whether it would be opened again. The women who came to mourn at the river understood something about River Mumma that the fishermen, who approached the river primarily in the register of livelihood and provision, did not always access. They understood that the river received the dead as well as the living. That the current, in its constant movement from mountain to sea, from the high cold source to the warm salt of the coast, carried things that had no other place to go, the grief that could not be spoken inside the house, the loss that was too large for any container that human hands had ever built, the love that had nowhere to land now that the person it was meant for was gone. Women came to the river in the days after a death with this grief. They came alone, usually, in the early morning or the late evening, and they stood at the bank or sat at the edge of the water, and they said what they could not say anywhere else. The river took it. This was understood not as a metaphor, not as a way of describing the psychological relief of expressing grief in a private place near moving water, though that relief was real and the women who experienced it knew it was real. It was understood as a literal transaction. The grief went into the river. The river carried it downstream. River Mumma, who knew everything the river carried, received it and held it and incorporated it into the vast accumulation of human experience that she had been collecting for centuries. The grief did not disappear, but it was no longer only yours. It was shared now, with something ancient and patient and infinitely capacious, something that had held grief before yours and would hold grief after yours and was not diminished by the holding. This was a specific and powerful kind of comfort. It did not require the grief to be over. It only required you to know that you were not carrying it alone. There is a story that circulates in the communities along the Black River, and I want to be precise about the geography here, because these stories are specific, because they belong to specific places and specific rivers, and the specificity matters. Because part of what makes them true is that they happened here, at this bend in this river, in this parish, in this particular quality of Jamaican light, a story about a woman who came to the river 3 nights after her husband died and sat at the edge of the water and talked until the river was the only light she could see. Not the moon, not the stars through the canopy of the trees, but the river, the green bioluminescent glow that rose from beneath the surface on the nights when River Mumma was fully present, when her attention was turned upward toward the bank and the people on it, when she was listening in the particular focused way that she listened when someone brought her something real. The woman talked. She said everything she had not been able to say in the house, in front of the children, in front of the neighbors who came with food and with their own nervousness about death and their need to fill the silence with practical conversation because the grief was too large and too close and made them afraid. She said what she actually felt, which was not only sadness, but also anger. And not only anger, but also the specific compound feeling that belongs to loving someone imperfectly across many years, and then losing them before you had finished working out how to do it right. She said all of that. And the river glowed brighter as she spoke, or she felt that it did, and whether the glow was literally brighter or whether her perception of it changed as she emptied herself of what she had been carrying is a question I am not going to answer, because I think it is the wrong question. The river was present. She was heard. She went home carrying less. That is the story. It is enough. Now let us talk about the plantation era, because no story about the Jamaican rivers can be told honestly without talking about what those rivers meant to the people who were enslaved on this island between the 17th and 19th centuries, and what River Mumma meant to those people, and what function the river served for human beings who had been stripped of almost everything that makes a human life legible to itself: community, language, name, family, the specific geography of home. But who had not been stripped of the knowledge that water is alive, that rivers are conscious, that the presence that moves through the water is a presence that the plantation system did not own and could not regulate and could not make to work for the profit of people who did not belong to it. This is a dimension of the River Mumma tradition that almost never appears in the tourist accounts, in the heritage pamphlets, in the versions of the story that have been processed through the machinery of national branding into something picturesque and manageable. But it is there in the older tellings, encoded in the specific details of the stories that survived, in the particular emphasis on the river as a place where the rules of the plantation did not apply, where the overseer's authority had no purchase, where the ground was not owned in the way that all the other ground was owned, because you cannot own a river the way you own land, because the river is always moving, always leaving, always arriving from somewhere else, always refusing to stay in. The place that the legal documents describe. The river was a sanctuary. Not in any formal, recognized, legally protected sense. The law that governed the plantation recognized no sanctuary that it had not itself created, but in the sense that matters most, which is the sense that belongs to the people who needed the sanctuary and found it and knew what they had found. The enslaved people who came to the Jamaican rivers came for water, yes. Came for fish. Came to wash. But they also came for what the water gave them that nothing else on the plantation gave them, which was a reminder of what they were outside the system that had been built to define them as something less than what they were. They came to a place where River Mumma was in charge, where the authority that mattered was the authority of something ancient and African and female, and entirely indifferent to the categories that the plantation had imposed on the landscape and on the people in it. They came to a place where, if they sat quietly at the bank in the early morning and knew how to be still and how to listen, they might feel something move through the water that had nothing to do with Jamaica 1780. That had everything to do with something much older and much larger and much less destroyable than any plantation ever built on this or any other island. This mattered. It mattered in the specific, survival-level way that anything matters that gives a person access to the part of themselves that the system of their oppression cannot reach. The river gave them that. River Mumma held that for them. The green glow in the water at night, in the years when the enslaved could not gather openly, when drums were prohibited and ceremonies were driven into the most hidden hours, that green glow was a sign. It said, "She is here. The old knowledge is here. The thing that was here before the ships came is still here. The water remembers what the land has been made to forget." There are accounts, not in the plantation records, which recorded the enslaved only as units of labor and value, but in the oral tradition that the communities along the Jamaican rivers have maintained across the centuries, of specific encounters in the plantation era. A man who was being hunted, who had run from the plantation and was being tracked through the hills toward the river, who reached the bank just before the people hunting him reached the top of the ridge behind him, and who waded into the current up to his chest and felt the water change around him, felt it become colder and deeper and more opaque, felt it close around him in a way that seemed deliberate, that seemed chosen, that seemed to be the river making a decision about who it would reveal and who it would conceal. The men on the ridge looked at the river. They saw nothing. They moved on. Whether the man prayed to River Mumma in that moment, or whether River Mumma acted because the tradition she embodied was on the side of the person fleeing rather than the people pursuing, the story does not specify. Perhaps both. Perhaps the distinction does not matter in the moral geography of a river that had been accumulating human experience long enough to know what justice looked like. And there is this, the tradition of leaving the comb. We spoke in episode 1 about the golden comb, about its nature, about what it represents, about the consequences of taking it without permission. But there is another dimension of the comb story that belongs specifically to the plantation era and that is almost never told alongside the more famous version. There were women, in those years, who came to the river and found the comb on the bank and did not take it and did not run from it, but sat with it. Sat near it. In its proximity. Not touching it, not claiming it, but close enough that the golden light of it was on their hands and their faces, close enough that the thing the comb represented, the sovereignty of River Mumma, the irreducible dignity of the female power that the river embodied, was close enough to be felt physically, in the body, in the specific way that proximity to something sacred is always felt in the body before it is processed by the mind. Those women came away from the river carrying something. Not the comb. Something you cannot hold in your hands. Something that the plantation, for all its precision about what it owned and what it controlled, had no instrument for measuring and no mechanism for taking away. They carried the knowledge that something in this landscape was on their side. That the most powerful presence in the water knew their name in a language that no deed of sale had ever been written in. That the river, in its flowing and its ancient and its perpetual refusal to be owned, was moving in the same direction they were moving, toward the sea, toward the horizon, toward whatever came after the thing they were enduring. The river always reached the sea. That too was a message. It always had been. What does a river carry? It carries the silt of the mountains, and the mineral memory of the rock it has been moving through for longer than any human community has been watching it. It carries the fish and the freshwater shrimp and the tiny organisms that live in the film of water just at the surface where the air and the river meet. It carries the reflections of the trees on its banks and the moon when the moon is above it and the face of the person who bends over it looking for their own face in the current. It carries the sound of itself, that specific, continuous, non-repeating sound of water moving over rock that is the oldest white noise in the world, that the human nervous system recognizes as safe before the human mind has any idea why. That belongs to some register of the organism that predates language and thought and everything that language and thought have built. And it carries all of this other thing. The accumulated experience of every person who has ever stood on its bank and brought it something, grief or gratitude, a fish hook or a flower, a question or a prayer, or just the specific wordless offering of presence, of being there, of having nowhere else to bring yourself that morning. River Mumma carries all of that. She has been carrying it for centuries. She is carrying it right now, in the deep cold channels under the surface of the Jamaican rivers that you cannot see from the bank, but that you can feel if you stand very still in the current and let the water tell you what the water knows. She is patient. She is permanent. And she remembers everything the river has been given, which means she remembers you, if you ever stood at a Jamaican river and offered it something true. She is there. The green light in the deep is not a trick of the water. It is her attention, turned upward, toward you, curious about what you have brought today, and whether it is the same as what you brought before or whether something in you has changed. Something in you has always changed. The river knows this before you do. That is why you keep coming back to it. River Mumma, Episode 2,